Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the joint webinar between DİPAM Istanbul and the Gulf State Analytics, Washington, D.C. My name is Adinada. I'm a specialist at DİPAM. I'll be your moderator this evening's discussion. Before we begin, I'd like to remind you that this webinar is recorded and may be watched at the DİPAM channel on YouTube. So before I introduce our distinguished speakers and dive into the questions, I'd like to begin with a brief introductory statement. The recent GCC summit that was taking place in Al-Ula marks the reunification between countries. After 3 years of the crisis in the region, the parties finally managed to begin a new chapter. Whilst the summit paves the way for cooperation, the disagreements and differences remain. The panel will discuss more of what would be the consequences of the summit and seek to disclose the challenges and the opportunities that may be found going forward. Right now, I am delighted to have our three distinguished speakers with us to discuss the related topic. We have Ambassador Mithat, who is the former Turkish ambassador to Qatar, former chair of the OECD Executive Committee, and Turkey's chief climate negotiator. Ambassador Rende, welcome to the webinar and thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
We have also Dr. Annelle, who is a research fellow at the Quincy Institute, Washington, D.C. Her research focuses on religious authority in the Middle East. Dr. SHELINE has also done an extensive field work in Egypt, Jordan, Morocco, Oman, Saudi Arabia, and Yemen. Dr. SHELINE, good morning to you and welcome to the panel. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. And we also have Dr. Najah Al-OTAIBI, who is a Saudi policy analyst based in London. Her research focuses on politics of gender, security and counterterrorism, public diplomacy, and soft power. She has worked for several think tanks in the UK and the US. Her PhD from the University of East Anglia examined roles of public diplomacy and soft power in Saudi-British relations. Dr. Al-OTAIBI, welcome to the webinar and thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
All right, we shall begin our discussion. First, I'll go to Dr. Al-OTAIBI. I'll start with the very general questions. So what has been the resolved? What has been resolved in the Al-Ula summit and what's yet to be resolved?
Well, I think it's too early to assume that there is something meaningful has been resolved. I think the summit is a major progress in returning relations to the pre-2017 crisis. But I will also think that it might take time for the GCC to fully reconcile and return the relations to how it used to be before. It's important now for all the countries, I think, to build confidence, to build the trust, and to test each other, especially to test Doha and its sincerity to improve the ties with the GCC and address the conditions agreed in the summit in relations to different issues, mainly the coverage of what happens in the Gulf, and also the sponsoring Islamist groups designated in most of the Gulf country as terrorist groups, such as the Muslim Brotherhoods. I think all these things need to be addressed by Qatar in order for the all GCC countries to have full reconciliation again.
Right, okay, thank you. So Dr. Al-OTAIBI made a statement that it was too early to assume what has been resolved and what is to be resolved. So now I would like to go to Dr. SHELINE with the same questions.
Thank you. Yeah, and I definitely agree with my esteemed colleague that it remains early to know. I do think that in general, it should be celebrated. It's great that the blockade of Qatar is lifted, but the underlying sources of tension have not yet been resolved. And I think in particular, this was a meeting between the GCC leaders, which again, the outcome is very much welcomed, but given the level of vitriol on social media between Saudi Arabia and the UAE on one side, Qatar on the other, as well as other, it wasn't limited only to those countries, but I think, users in those countries were especially vicious towards each other during the course of the blockade, it's not clear when or if social relations will be restored. So obviously families that were separated by the blockade are no doubt relieved, but at the societal level, tensions and suspicions persist. And I don't know if Mohammed bin Salman and Mohammed bin Zayed necessarily anticipated the level of animosity that their official positions would stir up, or if perhaps they were counting on them, that, you know, having adopted this position of aggression, that they sort of enjoyed or felt that the level of vitriol that then was directed against Qatar was useful to their agendas. Or if maybe they felt that maybe things have gotten too far out of hand. But regardless, my concern is that the fissure is too deep to be merely papered over with this agreement. I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. SHELINE. So Will, it's too early, as you agree with Dr. Al-OTAIBI. It should be celebrated. Right now, I'm going to Ambassador. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, Al-Otaibi Summit was an important one for two reasons. First of all, the lifting of the embargo after almost 3 years blockade, and the secondly is that the GCC showed for the first time, for a long period of time, for the first time, unity. So they felt they showed that they were united. It's important for the GCC. I agree with my friends that it will take time until confidence has been established or restored. Trust and confidence, it takes a day to lose or a few minutes, and then you need months and years to restore confidence. So it will take time. People have suffered immensely. It will take time to restore confidence, not only among member states of the GCC, the Gulf states, the Gulf monarchies, but also among the people, because they, especially the Qataris, suffered from an embargo, which I always thought that it was a disproportionate action. In order to bridge the differences, they could have, or they should have, resorted to diplomacy and dialogue, and they should have showed understanding to each other's maybe different views. I understand that of course the Gulf countries, and especially Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, they blamed Qatar of let's say supporting certain Islamic groups and maybe cozying with Iran and so on. But let's face it, I mean, in the Gulf, most of the countries of the Gulf, they at a point they supported certain groups which were considered as not so let's say benign by other sides, and therefore this is the situation. It will take time, and it will take time, and it will take also the political will of all the leaders in the Gulf, and especially the Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Kuwait. I appreciate very much the role played by Kuwait, and as the mediator, and hopefully in the years ahead, in the years to come, in the period ahead, that we can see a more united Gulf GCC at peace with itself and with its people.
Right, thank you, Ambassador. I'm sure our audience also share the same hope for the GCC in the future. Now, as
maybe one more point.
Sure,
Thank you, if I may. This blockade, everybody almost suffered from the blockade. Not only Qatar and the Qatari people, the whole region, especially compounded with low oil prices and the pandemic, they really felt the heat of this blockade, and especially Dubai, which is not an oil-rich emirate, and the economy is based on tourism, trade, and services. They also really suffered, and I hope that they will all now they realize that the situation is getting better, and they will work for peace and stability. And I hope that they will show understanding to each other's perspectives and views.
If I can weigh in on that with a two
Please.
finger, I obviously, the blockade clearly was detrimental for Gulf unity in general, but I do think it's also just very interesting to note the ability of Qatar to weather the embargo, that in many ways Qatar demonstrated its strength and that it was not going to be cowed by this, and left OPEC and has been doing quite well. Obviously it's easier for Qatar to not have to reroute its airplane flights, etc. Obviously it's obviously it's preferable for Qataris to not be under an embargo. But I think that Saudi Arabia and the UAE really miscalculated when they thought that they were going to be able to pressure Qatar by imposing this. And I think moving forward, Qataris might be hesitant to reintegrate, knowing that the tensions persist. And also that they were not so desperate that they, if the blockade and the embargo had continued, Qatar would have been fine. Again, not on the social level. It was difficult, and I know for many people living in Qatar, whether Qataris themselves or the large expat population, they're very glad that the blockade is over. But I could also understand their hesitance to necessarily jump back into the GCC with open arms. Again, knowing that a lot of these underlying sources of tension have not been addressed, and what's to say that something like this might not happen again. And so moving forward, I do acknowledge the ambassador's point about the suffering this entailed, but wanted to also just point out that Qatar came through quite, seemingly, doing just fine.
I agree. I agree with Dr. Sheline. Yes, the Qatari economy showed resilience unexpectedly. They really managed to deal with this embargo, although it was of course it was costly, and they had to inject additional cash into the economy, but they had enough resources, and also their close friends, they provided the necessary support, including support provided by Turkey. Probably that an air corridor was established, especially the land border. When it was closed, of course, the Qatari people were denied almost 90% of their food imports. Some of the food stuff and the food imports were from Saudi Arabia, and some of them arrived through Saudi Arabia. So at a point they had to deal with such with shortages and so on. But then from Morocco and from Turkey and other countries, their European friends, they reached out and provided the necessary, let's say, goods and food, but then they learned how to live with it. They learned. Qatar Airways suffered most, probably because of the rerouting of their flights, and but I agree that they really showed resilience, and they also rallied behind their emir. Yes, right. They were more united. But of course, look, let's face it, the Gulf countries, they are all cousins, and they belong to the same clans and the dynasties. It's only a problem of different approaches to different regional matters, and also different foreign policy issues. Especially Iran was also one of the main, let's say, bone of contentions, how to treat Iran and so on.
Right.
Sorry, let me just stop here.
That's okay. Thank you, Ambassador. So since you touched the issue of Iran, so I'd like to go to Dr. Al-OTAIBI. How will the GCC approach toward Tehran differ after the Outlast Summit?
That's such a complicated question. I honestly don't think there will be any sort of change, any sort of dialogue with Tehran at this stage, because even if Qatar, who offered to do a mediation between the GCC and Saudi Arabia, I think Saudi is not confident to have that dialogue with Iran, and because they can't trust Iran. A couple of hours ago, there was a drone fired by the Iran-backed Houthis to Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia has learned from the past experience with Iran that, and their proxies, that they got to change their policies before they come and have dialogue with them. Iran's destabilizing activities is obvious, and what they're doing it in front of the world. They are attacking civilians in Saudi Arabia. They are attacking energy establishments, even hospitals and airports. I mean, it's impossible that any dialogue will be with Iran at this stage before Iran has some sort of self-assessment and reversing some of its activities before they start any kind of reconciliation with Saudi and other GCC countries.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Al-OTAIBI. So you expect no difference behavior toward Iran, and mark that Iran's activities have been destabilizing. So Dr. SHELINE, on the same questions, what are your thoughts on this?
Yes. So I guess just, first of all, it is kind of ironic to remember that the Qatar crisis came out of the Trump administration's efforts to unite the GCC against Iran, when actually what happened was the internal splintering of the GCC against itself. I mean, it was on Trump's, first trip abroad, which he took to Saudi Arabia and Israel, on that trip that the UAE and Saudi Arabia convinced him that Qatar was the real villain here, and therefore Trump was okay when the embargo was launched, although apparently Secretary of State Rex Tillerson did prevent a ground invasion, or that's the rumor, that's what I've heard. And it took until the very end of Trump's term to finally get the GCC back together, sort of refocus it on Iran just in time for the Biden administration, which had been very clear on the campaign trail about its desire to return to the JCPOA, to re-enter the Iran nuclear deal in order to hopefully get Iran back into compliance and get them to stop advancing their progress towards a nuclear weapon. And so it's sort of interesting that now with this announcement, I think yesterday, of a defense alliance between Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, and Israel, which is obviously an anti-Iran coalition, that it seems that the Trump administration's efforts to align the region against Iran have paid off. Although again, it took a while, and it was actually through the Abraham Accords that is now allowing Israel to sort of openly form this defense agreement with both the UAE and Bahrain that it has officially normalized relations with, as well as with Saudi Arabia that it has an informal relation with, but has not officially normalized. So again, moving forward, I think, as we've already said, the tensions remain within the GCC. I don't think that countries like Qatar or Oman or Kuwait would be willing to necessarily join this defense alliance against Iran. And so this question of how will the GCC approach differ is based on the assumption that there will be a GCC approach, whereas increasingly I do expect to see more collaboration between the sort of three belligerents against Qatar, who, Bahrain, UAE, well, Saudi Arabia, UAE, as well as Bahrain, sort of along for the ride to a certain extent, that they will, and now allying or working closely with Israel. Whereas, Qatar, Oman, and Kuwait, I think are likely to continue their relative, well, in particular Qatar and Oman, they're relatively, if not friendly, at least continue their relationship with Iran. And the hope going forward that Qatar and Oman and Kuwait could perhaps facilitate future negotiations if Biden is able to get the US back into the JCPOA, if Iran comes back into compliance, and then the possibility of building from there on encouraging Iran to come back. move away from a nuclear weapon, as well as to address, many of the alarming activities that my colleague, Dr. Al-OTAIBI, was mentioning, and especially in terms of support for the Houthis, which clearly at this point, Saudi Arabia is feeling the impossibility of walking back from Yemen right now, given the level of belligerence coming from the Houthis. Although just one note on that, even it would be extremely useful for Iran to stop supporting the Houthis. I think it's important that all of the foreign actors that are involved in Yemen completely withdraw their interference and support, and that very much includes Iranian support for the Houthis, as well as UAE support for groups like the Southern Transitional Council in the south, as well as Saudi Arabia needs to stop bombing and lift the blockade. But that the Houthis are going to continue their belligerence regardless, even if they lose Iran's support. I don't think, the Houthis have said that if Saudi Arabia stops bombing, they will also stop. And so perhaps that is true, and that Saudi Arabia should test them on that. But they're not going to stop their actions and their push for power within Yemen, even if they lose the support of Iran.
Thank you, Dr. SHELINE. I'd like to go to Ambassador now. Yes.
Thank you. Yes, you might recall that that the rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran is not new. It's not a new one. Both countries, they have their own interpretation of Islam, and then they use their own interpretation as a foreign policy tool. And it is this ideology is a global one. And this is why we don't expect a kind of reconciliation to happen in the near future. But let's face it also that the threat perception of the Gulf countries is not the same. Certain Gulf countries have different threat perception as regards Iran. And probably Iran will continue to with its activities in the region. What makes Iran a kind of interlocutor for the United States? Why, for example, the United States and especially Biden administration opted to talk to Iran? It's very important. The Gulf countries should be able to understand Biden administration's policies towards Iran. Iran's the decision by the United States, or the will, the declared will and intention to return to the nuclear deal, is an important policy change on the part of the United States, and I think the Gulf countries will try to understand the situation. During the telephone call between King Sulaiman bin Abdulaziz and President Biden yesterday, I understand that they also agreed that the Yemen, the war in Yemen should stop, that a comprehensive settlement should be reached. It is the desire of the United States, the expressed desire at least, and that Biden administration decided to stop supporting the activities of Saudi Arabia in Yemen. I hope that with this human tragedy will be put into end. It will be resolved. But yes, Dr. SHELINE rightly said that there is an agreement now between Israel and the Saudis and the United Arab Emirates. Because they have the same maybe threat perception and same policies towards Iran. Iran should be kept, according to these countries, out of the Middle East and out of the Arab world and Arab territories. And the Iranians should stop supporting their friends in Yemen. In Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon. This is what let's say Saudis and other friends, their friends, would like to see Iranian kept out of this region. So it will take time, but I think they should prefer the dialogue. The dialogue is the best way to not to establish alliances and try to confront Iran by military means, but I think we should encourage dialogue. This is why I welcomed Biden's administration decision to to negotiate with the Iranians with a view to reaching a kind of settlement and to be able to lift the embargo. And then the Iranians maybe could also comply with the nuclear deal, which will be in the interest of the region as a whole.
Yeah. Right. Thank you, Ambassador. So as I'm sure now, as you know, some of the audience would like to understand more. So what changes we may expect from Saudi in terms of foreign policy in post-Al-Ula Summit, Dr. Al-OTAIBI?
Well, I think the most significant development in terms of Saudi foreign policy after Al-Ula is indeed the blockade on Qatar, and also convincing the other GCC countries that this is the right thing to do, because not all GCC countries have the same will to do so. And I'm talking about the UAE and Bahrain. And I guess that's because each of these countries have their own problems, which is different than the other countries with Qatar. So convincing the GCC that reconciliation with Qatar is the right thing is a important move by Saudi Arabia in terms of foreign policy. And I know that after issuing the declaration of Al-Ula, the kingdom has called each GCC countries to have bilateral talks with Doha so that they can discuss binding issues and mechanism to move forward and achieve all these clauses by the summit. And we have seen in the last few days that the UAE started, and some Emirati officials met with Qatari officials to discuss these binding issues. And I think after that, we will see the impact of that on other aspects of Saudi foreign policy. But I think now it's just the ending the blockade in Qatar is the most important move by Saudi.
Right. So that's the most important thing, according to Dr. Al-OTAIBI. Dr. SHELINE?
Yeah, thinking about Saudi's foreign policy moving forward, I do think it is interesting perhaps to understand the extent to which Al-Ula represents sort of a shift. Essentially, that up until this point, or perhaps somewhat earlier, this was the clearest break between the UAE and Saudi Arabia. And so as Dr. Al-OTAIBI said, Emirati officials did just meet with Qatari officials in Kuwait, and hopefully they were able to address some lingering concerns or issues, or just, if not address, at least move towards closer engagement in the future. But in general, it was somewhat clear, as my colleague said, that this was Saudi Arabia leading the way on the Al-Ula Summit. And so, and I think that was partly because the UAE felt that it had already sort of guaranteed itself a place of favor in the eyes of the US with the Abraham Accords. Because, Biden had made very clear that he intended to make Saudi Arabia a so-called pariah as a result of the blockade of Qatar and the devastation of Yemen. And so Saudi Arabia knew that it had to do something to get back on Biden's good side, whereas the UAE didn't have to worry about that so much because they had demonstrated their utility as a security partner, especially through the Abraham Accords, which then earned them the possibility of access to the F-35 aircraft, although at the moment that has been suspended or at least paused for review. And so just all of that to say that for the past few years, we had seen the UAE and Saudi Arabia acting somewhat in lockstep with each other towards on the foreign policy sphere, especially places like Yemen, obviously towards Qatar. Whereas moving forward, I do anticipate perhaps more divergence between them. And my understanding is that Mohammed bin Zayed and Mohammed bin Salman have not been as closely in contact, perhaps not even speaking, at least in the months leading up to the Al-Ula Summit. It's unclear if they've subsequently been in touch. But so moving forward, the hope, my hope is that Mohammed bin Salman has learned that it's really in his interest, in his efforts to push Saudi Arabia to be a regional leader, a global leader, in fulfilling Vision 2030, in providing a better future for the Saudi people. It is imperative that he adopt a more cooperative attitude, that he work with other countries, including, hopefully working closely with the United States to pursue broader stability. And hopefully he's learned from the disastrous war in Yemen that military action often does not go the way countries think it does. As an American, I should know that better than anyone. The United States has been the worst offender in this case, that, when you start firing guns and launching invasions, things often don't go the way you'd hoped, and it's extremely expensive, and everything can be much worse as a result, which is unfortunately the result also of the war in Yemen. That Iran is clearly much more involved now with the Houthis. The Houthis are more powerful than they were when the war began. And so military intervention clearly has not worked. And so again, the hope moving forward is that Mohammed bin Salman will be willing to adopt a more conciliatory regional policy and global policy. Whereas I think Mohammed bin Zayed, he's older, he's perhaps somewhat more set in his ways, and he has demonstrated perhaps an equal, if not greater, appetite for adventurism. Obviously, the UAE's destabilizing actions in Libya is a prime example of that, although the ambassador could perhaps speak to the role of Turkey in countering that and pushing back against Emirati efforts there. So I can't say for certain if Saudi Arabia will adopt a more conciliatory or diplomatic policy, but my hope is that Mohammed bin Salman is young, knows that he will likely be in power for decades to come, and so in order to implement his very ambitious Vision 2030 and to keep the many promises that he made to his large and very young Saudi population, he's going to have to stop investing in very expensive failures like the war on Yemen and instead focus more resources and attention on keeping his promises to the Saudi people.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Sheline. Now we're going to the ambassador.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Well, I would argue that that the position expressed by Biden and his team before the elections made it maybe possible for the lifting of the embargo, and probably the Saudi dynasty and the rulers felt the need to do something before Biden would assume the presidency. Because you might recall that President Biden, even during his speech in one of his speeches at the Foreign Council of Foreign Relations, he emphasized a few points. He made a few very strong, in fact, points. One is that he said he will fight authoritarian regimes. He will defend democracy, and then he will defend also human rights and fundamental freedoms. So these messages, of course, were received by many countries and by many rulers, and I think that Mohammed bin Salman and King Salman, they also prepared for Biden administration by introducing maybe certain reforms. And just recently, as I said yesterday, when they called each other, they had this telephone conversation. According to the White House spokesperson and the statement and made that President Biden emphasized the importance of the rule of law. So it was the rule of law, which was, and human rights, fundamental freedoms were emphasized. The war in Yemen should stop. This was another point. And the fourth point, the last point, was that there will be transparency in the relationship between Saudi Arabia and the United States, which means that it suggests that during the Trump administration, the relationship were not so transparent. that behind closed doors certain decisions were taken and nobody knew about what sort of decisions were taken and so on. So what the United States expect from Saudi Arabia and the Gulf dynasties is that the rule of law should be enhanced. And this means that the culture of impunity, which prevails in many countries in the region, in fact, beyond the Gulf and the Middle East also and beyond, the culture of impunity should be left. It should be replaced by the culture of by rule of law and by the independence of judiciary, if possible, by respecting human rights and the freedom of expression. And here, of course, I hope that the reforms introduced or likely to be introduced by the Saudi dynasty and by the Saudi rulers, especially Mohammed bin Salman. I think he is the first personality who was responsible for devising new strategies and reforms. What is important here is that they should maybe try to control the clergy, because unfortunately or fortunately, I don't know, in my view, it's unfortunately, the clergy, also it is the situation in Iran and in many other countries, the clergy has disproportionate power. The clergy should stay out of politics. If we're talking about the rule of law and human rights and fundamental freedoms and so on, the clergy should stay out of politics. The clergy controls social life and education, everything. What we need in the Gulf is quality education and also equal opportunities in the field of education. So keep the clergy out of education. You need modern education. You need to educate your people with new technologies and so on. So this is it's a huge maybe a job, and it's a very challenging one for Mohammed bin Salman. But I think if he wants to make history, he should introduce drastic measures in order to limit the role of clergy in the field of social life and education, and that would completely change the picture. Of course, 2030 vision is a very ambitious plan. It is. I had the chance to run through it, but is it sustainable? It remains to be seen whether it is sustainable under the present oil prices, because normally you see this downward trend in the oil prices, and recently it went well, and we will see whether oil prices will go up or remain around $60 per barrel. But with the present oil prices, it is quite difficult to, for example, build a $500 billion NEOM technology city and so on. So I hope that I made my message clear.
Right. Thank you, Ambassador. You made.
Can I weigh in on that as well? I mean,
Sure.
I don't want to jump on my Saudi colleague who obviously has much deeper insights than I do, but I would just push back against sort of, so in general, yes, I absolutely agree that the Wahhabi establishment in Saudi Arabia has historically been very powerful. But part of the narrative that MBS has been promoting is that he's reigning in the clerics. But most of the people he's thrown in jail are not actually, they're not members of the establishment. They're not members of the High Council of Ulama. They are prominent thinkers like Salman al-Auda, who himself is actually advances, although still a very deeply conservative interpretation of Islam, he does challenge some of the conventional thinking and really encourages very deeply religious Saudis to rethink some of the sort of messages that they have received from the Saudi religious establishment. And so the fact that he is in jail, someone who could perhaps help to shift Saudi Arabia, the thinking of a lot of very deeply conservative religious Saudis in a new and hopefully more productive direction, completely negates Mohammed bin Salman's stated project of trying to promote so-called moderate Islam, when in fact he should be trying to partner with people like Salman al-Auda, but instead he sees him as a threat because he's not a member of the establishment. In general, the Al Saud have been quite effective at controlling the Saudi religious establishment, using it for their own religious legitimacy, but when it gets out of hand, they're ready to put it back in its cage. Obviously, we saw, for example, during the so-called awakening in the early 90s, when the Al Saud did perhaps feel somewhat threatened by the extent of the popularity of the clerics, one of whom was Salman al-Auda, that really were pushing back against Saudi decisions, especially things like the decision to host US troops in Saudi Arabia following the first Gulf War due to concerns about Saddam Hussein. Obviously, that was one of the key grievances of Osama bin Laden, who then, obviously 9/11 and everything else that happened, there were big implications for the United States. But in general, I do think it's very important, especially for Americans who may not understand some of the nuances, who don't understand much about Islam and don't understand much about the way sort of governance works in Saudi Arabia, that Mohammed bin Salman claims to be reigning in the clerics, but in fact, some of the most conservative, some of the clerics that have said the most egregious things about women or about Shia or just in general, remain quite entrenched in their positions of power because they are willing to toe the government line and affirm Mohammed bin Salman, or at least not criticize him for the ways that he is making significant shifts on the surface level, sort of in terms of women's ability to sort of engage in the public sphere and to work and to move around publicly, especially in cities like Riyadh, where historically that was much more difficult for women. So I intend that not as a contradiction of what the ambassador said, but more as just a little bit more context for people who may not understand this sort of the extent to which Mohammed bin Salman, I think, benefits from lack of awareness of what's going on in Saudi Arabia.
All right, thank you, Dr. SHELINE.
Yeah, may I just?
Yes, Ambassador.
Yes, thank you. Well, I just do hope that you say I lived in the Gulf. I served my country for 3 years in the Gulf and had the chance to travel also around, and also I accompanied our president when we went to certain high-level meetings in Mecca and elsewhere. What I would hope is that maybe at a point the culture of peace and tolerance could be promoted. You see, because mainstream, if you study mainstream Islam is about compassion, is about peace, it's about tolerance and understanding. It's about taking care of your neighbor, and it's all about charity, and it's not about killing in the name of God. So this is a problem. So in the Gulf and in the Middle East as a whole, we need to educate our people that you cannot kill in the name of God, and you don't go to heaven for killing the so-called infidels, those who are not necessarily do not belong to your creed or to your denomination. So this is what I would hope, that maybe by saying that the clergy should be controlled and should stay out of politics, should stay out of education, because you see, look at Saudi Arabia and the Gulf. 70% of the people of Saudi Arabia are below 30. They are young, and they follow the social media, and they would like to have a decent life and jobs and the future, and they would like to have families, and this is why if we don't educate them properly, as they deserve the best education, and they have the means, they have the revenues, the oil revenues and gas revenues, if you educate them properly, they will have a better life and a better future for the region as a whole. This culture of war is bad, and zero tolerance to other people is too bad. And I hope that maybe with the arrival of Biden administration, and if they mean what they say, if Biden really will act as he preaches, and really cares about democratic values, about human rights and fundamental freedoms, about tolerance and understanding the other side, I hope that we can change this part of the world together.
Thank you, Ambassador.
I would love our Saudi colleague to weigh in, as opposed to the two of us talking about Saudi Arabia.
Right, Dr. Al-OTAIBI, is there anything you'd like to say about this?
Yeah, I would like to add a point about education. I have recently published my report about education, which looked at all the changes that Saudi Arabia has done over the last 3 years and since Mohammed bin Salman launched Vision 2030. And I don't know if you have read it, Mr. Ambassador, because all the changes were massive. Including revising of all these intolerant ideologies, removing all the extremist content, including market-oriented modules, and even reducing the amount of religious modules in the Saudi education. Now Saudis, they only taught one module of Islam, and it's called Islamic culture. And they also teach about other cultures. They teach students tolerance and be respectful of others. The education reform is really massive. But I'm not sure if they're in Washington or in Istanbul, they are aware of it, but there's so much going on. And a couple of days ago, Saudi Arabia has allowed foreign universities to open branches because they wanted foreign education to contribute to the general education of Saudi Arabia.
I just want to affirm that, yes, I think the textbook reforms, education reforms, there has been a lot of excitement about them. I know when I was in Saudi Arabia and spoke with a US official at the US embassy, that was something he, at the time, 2 years ago, still felt a little bit frustrated that the Saudis were not necessarily doing it yet. And yet clearly in the intervening 2 years, a lot has happened. I know that Human Rights Watch put out a report that very much acknowledged the changes, but also pointed out the fact that there were still some issues of concern, especially around language towards Shia and Sufi practices, but that in general, a lot of the passages, around, intolerance, especially towards Jews or towards Christians, had absolutely, my understanding had been completely removed, and that in general, education reform is an iterative process, and it's possible that this current step was taken because it was what was possible at the time, and hopefully in the future we'll see additional progress on this. But I want to acknowledge that, yes, people are paying attention over here.
Right. Thank you so much.
May I just thank you, Dr. Al-OTAIBI. Sure. What you said is music to my ears. It's quite promising, as you rightly said, that I would be more than happy to read your report about this, the reform in the field of education. But of course, it's in the Gulf. It's more important to see the deeds. The deeds should match the words, and what is written should be implemented. It's so important because not only in the Gulf, as I say, in the region as a whole. In many cases, we start, we prepare fantastic constitutions, and we do not implement them. It is the case in many countries, including my own. So this is why we will wait and see if the rulers of Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states are really willing to change in accordance with the desire of their people, of their young people. It's so important, because normally then they would be blamed of being detached from their societies. It's so important because we have so many dynasties there. And sometimes their legitimacy is questioned by certain groups because they are told, they are blamed of being detached from their societies. And this educational reform, or the reform in the field of education, and this 2030 vision, and the effort by the Saudi king and the crown prince to diversify the economy, they are great strides, and I hope that they will be able to manage and to be successful in these fields. It's so important.
Right. Thank you, Ambassador. So it seems that we all agree that education reform is significant. Also, we expect the transparency of the relationship between US and Saudi, that the rule of law should be enhanced. Now, moving on to the next question, I'll go to Dr. SHELINE. Some may remember the Al-OTAIBI Summit of reunification. So what is the background that made reunification in January 2021 possible? In other words, why January 2021? Sorry, 2021.
Yeah, so I started to get into this a little bit before. Essentially, I think a huge part of it was the incoming Biden administration, the fact that Biden had won. And as I said, Saudi Arabia felt concerned that they were seen as a liability from the US perspective, whether both in terms of the Qatar crisis, in terms of the war on Yemen, and as well as other concerns the U.S. has, things like the oil price war back in April, when Trump was very upset that Mohammed bin Salman and Russia or Putin were continuing to chase the bottom, and when oil prices dipped below zero, and Trump was very upset about this. So there are a lot of issues that Saudi Arabia knows that the incoming Biden administration was not going to tolerate, to the extent that Trump was willing to tolerate so much of Saudi's bad behavior regionally. And like I said, the UAE was much less concerned about this, because they had demonstrated their utility as a security partner with normalizing with Israel. Whereas from the Saudi perspective, at this point, especially while King Salman remains alive and in charge, it is very unlikely that Saudi Arabia would normalize with Israel. It remains to be seen whether under a king, Mohammed bin Salman, if Saudi Arabia would in fact normalize with Israel, or this sort of informal relationship that Saudi Arabia has, if this already is serving their needs sufficiently, and MBS would not necessarily be willing to undermine his own legitimacy or that of the Al Saud in general as the guardians of the two holiest sites in Islam, by normalizing by Israel. So all that to say, I think that the UAE probably would have preferred if Saudi Arabia had chosen to address or ameliorate the situation in Yemen, because the UAE had already done so. If Saudi Arabia had been able to pull out the way the UAE did, and MBZ would have preferred Saudi Arabia to keep the pressure up on Qatar, that the UAE continues to see Qatar as being far too willing to be cozy with Islamist groups or send them support, etc. And just in general, the UAE and Qatar continue to be on the opposite side of various regional issues. And so I think that this gets back to what I was saying about the decoupling between Mohammed bin Salman and Mohammed bin Zayed, that allowed this to happen, that Saudi Arabia decided no, it was in fact more in their interest to lift the blockade, to end, resolve the Qatar crisis, and that they're not ready to pull out of Yemen, as we already discussed, the extent to which Saudi Arabia feels very much is attacked by the Houthi rebels sending missiles over the border as far into Saudi Arabia as Riyadh, hundreds of miles away. And so I think that's so not to be a stereotypical American and say that it's all about American policy that this happened, but I do think that was definitely a significant factor in accelerating the urgency with which Saudi Arabia decided that it was time to show the incoming Biden administration that they are not only sort of a factor of instability in the region, but in fact can push for greater stability. And also moving forward, it's possible that the Saudis anticipated the likelihood that the Biden administration would be reaching out to Iran, and that at this point the ongoing embargo of Qatar was just kind of a distraction, that it's important for the GCC to remain so bogged down in its own internal squabbles, and instead focus attention on Iran as what it perceives as this big regional threat. So that's the American perspective, that Biden's win had a lot to do with it, as well as Saudi concerns about sort of shifts that might be forthcoming in the region as a result.
Right. So I'd like to go to Dr. Al-OTAIBI.
Well,
2021?
I don't agree actually with my colleague, because I think Saudi Arabia simply realized that the time has come for the Gulf state to have a dialogue. And especially now with the recent geopolitical developments and the COVID pandemic, which is paralyzing everything, including the economy, Saudi Arabia thinks that the GCC is stronger when they are united. So they have initiated the reconciliation. And I remember the Saudi foreign minister said during the summit that the GCC should forge a coherent policy to confront all our common challenges, including Iran's destabilizing activities. Saudi Arabia cannot tolerate with more of Iran's nuclear and missiles programs. It cannot also deal with its regional proxies, including the Houthis, who are in the borders of Saudi Arabia, killing civilians. So all of these issues, I think, are central and have accelerated the need for reconciliation.
Right. Thank you. Now, I'd like to go to the ambassador.
Thank you. Thank you. First of all, let's keep in mind that in the Gulf, the United States is the arbiter in the Gulf, and they set the tune, whether you like it or not. Because of the geopolitical importance of the Gulf and the whole region, I agree with Dr. SHELINE that the United States decided to reach out to Iran and to engage with Iran for its own interest, because China has already reached out to Iran. And Russia is quite involved and trying to improve their relations with Iran. So you cannot just wait and see, wait and watch the Chinese to invest $400 billion during the next 3 decades in Iran and create a kind of wall between the Western world and the rest in Asia. So I think they're doing well, and they should encourage also their friends in the Gulf to engage with Iran through a certain degree of dialogue, because you cannot just fight Iran through by establishing alliances and so on. We have already had a terrible war, which was badly conceived, and that was which was started by Mohammed bin Salman in 2015 in Yemen, and we had a human tragedy. 14 million people are suffering now, near starvation. The situation is, and I think Biden has done a good job by telling the Saudis that this war should stop. But unfortunately, other countries, other allies of the United States, they continue to provide ammunition and weapons. The war should stop in Yemen. This is the first. It will be maybe the first positive sign or positive, let's say, result of Biden administration, if Biden administration is willing to do something in the Gulf. Why it is so important for America to be in the Gulf? With CENTCOM and in Qatar, with the deployment of 11,000 soldiers also in the region and more, because they would like to secure, let's say, to secure the security, or to guarantee the security of Israel and its people. They would like also to control the energy resources, and to keep China and Russia, if possible, under control in the region. It's such a strategic place. And the United States has been there for so many decades, and they intend to stay there. But I hope that they will be forces for good, and they will be able to, let's say, put their weight behind, let's say, peace and stability. because the people are really suffering there, and they need peace, and they need stability and security.
Right. Thank you, Ambassador.
If I can respond to that
Sure.
again.
Dr. SHELINE, yes.
Right. Thank you, Adinda. So two things. I think the most important thing, I very much want to affirm the absolute necessity of finding a resolution to the war in Yemen. And I think that as the ambassador said, it's encouraging that Biden made a very clear statement about this when he said the war must end earlier this month, but a statement while at the State Department. But it's important to keep in mind that Biden can't necessarily end the war, that there are what's happening inside Yemen should go back to being a domestic conflict. So that at the moment, the result of Saudi intervention, Emirati intervention, Iranian intervention, as well as additional sort of smaller players, are continuing to fuel the conflict and incentivizing additional conflict. You know, we know that civil wars end when either you get an overwhelming military victory, which is unlikely in Yemen, given what we've seen so far, given the ability of sort of this, what initially seemed like a ragtag group of Houthi rebels to not only be successful, but significantly expand their footprint on the ground and their control over the population of Yemen. So again, unlikely that we're going to see a military win, given the amount of resources Saudi Arabia in particular has already poured into trying to achieve that. Or you have to end, you know, the warring parties on the ground in a civil war have to sort of run out of the will or the resources to fight. And so at the moment, as long as foreign countries continue to pour in external resources, we're going to just continue to see, you know, the warlords benefiting. They have no incentive to stop. They're getting wealthy. They're building villas on the outskirts of Sana'a and elsewhere in the country. And there's really no reason, you know, for them to stop. The Houthis in particular benefit from war. They're very young. They see themselves as able to sort of take all of Yemen and then march all the way to Jerusalem. These are the statements that they make, and they at the moment they've had no reason to perceive otherwise, because reality has borne out their ability to take and hold territory and expand their power. And so moving forward, obviously, there's been a lot of concern right now about the Houthi assault on the crucial city of Ma'rib, which is very important center for Yemeni petroleum, oil and gas production, has also sort of been a bastion of stability where hundreds of thousands of Yemenis have fled, internally displaced Yemenis have fled violence elsewhere and fled the Houthis elsewhere. And so Ma'rib is the sort of the last stronghold of the internationally recognized government of President Hadi, who's in exile in Riyadh. And so there's been very much concern that at the moment, the Houthis are launching an assault, will continue to launch an assault. And so some voices within Yemen are saying they actually don't want Biden to prevent Saudi Arabia from sort of assisting the Hadi government as they have done thus far, although again, some have said the Saudis have not in fact done enough, or they haven't allowed the Hadi government to really significantly push back against the Houthis. They've just sort of allowed them to maintain a status quo that again reflects this long-term policy of Saudi Arabia sort of playing different groups off against each other in Yemen. So I think the most important thing that Biden can do, although he can't necessarily address the internal dynamics, he can help hopefully to pressure the Saudi Arabias, the Saudis and the Emiratis to withdraw militarily from Yemen, and hopefully to pressure Iran as well to stop supporting the Houthis in order to allow a ceasefire to take place in Yemen. And again, I know a lot of people say the Houthis are not going to be willing to accept a ceasefire. And so the only language they understand is violence. And they, you know, these people advocate for Saudi Arabia to extend additional military support. But again, I think we've observed on the ground in Yemen, this has been devastating for the population, and so many people just want to survive, and at this point don't really care who's in charge. They just want the bombs to stop falling, and they want the blockade, the Saudi imposed blockade, to be lifted to allow food and fuel and basic necessities to come into the country to prevent the UN has said that 2.25 million children are likely to starve in the coming months. That's on top of, as the ambassador said, the hundreds of thousands who have already been killed as a result largely of airstrikes by Saudi Arabia. but also the starvation and preventable diseases that are the result of the ongoing blockade, as well as, the Houthis again have not been allowing aid in. This is why the United States canceled it's the aid last year through USAID, and that's another thing Biden could do, which is crucial, is to restart aid to Yemen. So all this to simply affirm the absolute urgent need for a change in the current incentives on the ground in Yemen, which are currently fostering additional violence to the vast detriment of the Yemeni people.
Dr. SHELINE.
Yes.
Dr. SHELINE, I'm watching with, so may I intervene?
Ambassador, yes, you may.
Because I'm so perplexed. It's the power of the media, the Western media. You see, the way you speak, you talk. You really. I see that the power of the media. You reflect the power of the Western media. How this war in Yemen is told, the narrative. It's really stunning. I'm so surprised that what we just talk about, that the Houthis just don't want peace. They would like to continue fighting. That they are not interested in sharing power. That, you see, the Houthis, even during the Ottoman Empire, they represent 1/3 of the people of Yemen. And even during the Ottoman Empire, which ruled over 400 years, they were provided with their autonomous, region. They are formidable fighters. Yes, it's true. And probably they would like to continue fighting until they have received their part. Let's say they would like to share power. And also, quite interesting that you don't mention that the Saudis and the Emiratis, they bombed even their farmlands, let alone their houses and homes and infrastructure. The Saudis destroyed the water infrastructure, the electricity infrastructure, the farmlands were bombarded. Can you imagine? And Joseph Biden, the president, said that the time has come for the war to stop in Yemen. Why the war? Why the time has come only on the 20th of January? Why the Americans, looking at what happened with all this human tragedy, with the destruction of children, the killing of thousands and hundreds of thousands of people, why the time has come only on the 20th of January for America to stop the war in Yemen? Is it really meaningful? Is it really moral? This is why I feel so bad to listen to you. I mean, to the way you explained and you demonized the Houthis. It's so sad because they are part of this population of Yemen. 1/3 of the people are maybe Houthis. And they would like to have their own share in running affairs in Yemen, whether they are supported by the Saudis, by the Iranians, or part of them now are maybe supported by the United Arab Emirates, because I understand that the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia are not on the same page as regards the future of Yemen. The Emiratis are trying to build a new kind of southern Yemen, state of southern Yemen. The Russians are so happy about it because they also started, also engaging with the southern Yemenis. So let's stop this war. Let's stop this human tragedy. It is the worst human tragedy during the last maybe so many decades.
No, I absolutely agree. And I don't want to in any way, take away from the absolute destruction that has been wreaked by Saudi Arabia and the UAE. But it's interesting you frame this as a Western media narrative. I mean, unfortunately, in the West, in the United States, I don't think there's much understanding of Yemen in general. People see the images of starving children, but there's very little nuance So my statements about the Houthis reflect my conversations with people in Yemen and outside of Yemen who have fled their violence and been subjected to their violence, who don't want the Houthis to take full control. And I think if the Houthis were in fact willing to share power in Yemen, that would be, that is the hope. And this is part of why I argue that a ceasefire is necessary, just across the board, in order to then allow humanitarian aid and to prevent the death of millions, many of whom are children, that children are especially vulnerable to starvation. So again, you know, the worst actor here, I think, is Saudi Arabia in its devastation of Yemen. But I think there are a lot of people on the ground in Yemen who are worried that Biden is trying to push for just, you know, a quick way to wash his hands of it, just impose a ceasefire, leave the Houthis in charge and of the north and the Southern Transitional Council in charge of the south, and wash his hands of it and walk away. And I think many in Yemen are just frustrated with that sort of attitude. But I do very much agree with you that if the Houthis were in fact willing to share power, then, and it's like, you know, moving forward, the Houthis are a reality in Yemen, and they will likely be part of any sort of future ruling coalition. I think just what I've heard from people who have fled their violence is they don't think that they're willing to share power, and that's why they're so worried.
Yeah, it's impossible. If there is a will, on the part of the Americans to stop this war and to keep maybe the Russian Federation out of the whole this exercise, they should really act quickly, and I'm sure that they have the will. Biden has the will, and then they have the means to convince the people of Yemen to get together and stop this war and maybe reach a kind of, because you need also a post-war, a post-conflict rehabilitation process. It's not that easy. I dealt with the Bosnian War when I was a young diplomat. I was a member of Friends of Bosnia. So it took years. You might recall, post-conflict rehabilitation. It's not only to establish new homes, to build new homes and get people food and water and so on. It's post-conflict rehabilitation, which is the most difficult part of a conflict. This is why this war was a terrible mistake on the part of the Saudis.
So,
Ambassador, if I may.
And yes, please go ahead.
Go ahead.
So since we touched the issue of war in Yemen, I'd like to go to Dr. Al-OTAIBI. What consequences, if any, will Outlast Summit have on the ongoing conflict in Yemen?
Well, I think the Gulf crisis has caused division, obviously, in Yemen and its political elites. And I guess if there is the conciliation among the GCC countries could potentially build confidence among different leaders in different Yemeni parties, who's now, each of them are supported by each country, GCC country. For example, Al-Islah Party is supported by Qatar. The Hadith Party is supported by Saudi Arabia. I think the reconciliation among the GCC countries will build the confidence among all these groups, which will support the process of peace building, and hopefully it will strengthen the position of the legitimate government.
Right, thank you, Dr. Al-OTAIBI. I'm going to Ambassador Rende. You mentioned earlier in the conversation about the role of Kuwait. So let's explore that a bit more. So what will be the role? What has been the reaction to the Outlast Summit from some of the smaller Gulf states?
The smaller Gulf states, I think,
yes.
First of all, publicly they expressed their pleasure and their satisfaction that there was such a the lifting of the embargo, and also they expressed unity. The arrival of Mohammed bin Salman at the airport, hugging the Emir of Qatar, kissing and hugging. All these were good signs in the interest of unity in the Gulf. But as we said earlier, what is missing is the restoration of confidence. It's confidence. You need to trust the other side that they are not only kissing and hugging, but they are wholeheartedly hugging. and that they are interested in long-term good relationship and cooperation and collaboration. As I said, it is in the interest of the United States to have a united GCC. The United States is the setter, the standard setter there, and I expect the Biden administration to encourage all other states, including Oman and Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates. I understand that that they have special. They have the relationship between Qatar and the United Arab Emirates is more problematic. I understand. It seems to be personal between the rulers, and I hope that they will leave it behind, that this issue of maybe personal rivalry. Maybe what you need is in the Gulf is this Saudi Arabia and also other friends of the Gulf to encourage the United Arab Emirates to engage in a meaningful dialogue. Also with Turkey, for example, we have strained relations with some Gulf countries like the United Arab Emirates, and also with Saudi Arabia. Also, especially the assassination of Jamal Khashoggi, and I understand that the United States will release the declassified report recently, very soon. It was expressed that this report by the intelligence agency of the United States will be released very, very soon, maybe in a day or two. We don't know yet. I'm not aware of the content, but the assassination of Jamal Khashoggi led to worsening relations between Turkey and Saudi Arabia, because Khashoggi was killed in Istanbul at the consulate, the Saudi consulate, and now we will have a report about this assassination, and it might reflect badly on the image of Saudi Arabia. So the Saudi-Turkish relations should also be improved. You see, during King Abdullah, we had quite good relations. We had 200 companies working and trying to build infrastructure, major projects in Saudi Arabia. Maybe about 80,000 Turkish people were working in Saudi Arabia. Now it seems that they have also an informal boycott of Turkish goods. Formally, there is no decision, but we understand that Turkish goods are not welcome. They are boycotting them, and Turkish companies are not invited to bid for major projects. So this is the situation. What we would like to see is that we leave all these problems behind. We know that we have different opinions about regional problems, regional Libya, Syria, about the situation in Iraq, in Yemen. We have different views. We're not, we don't see eye to eye regarding certain regional problems. But we hope that we can improve our relations with the Saudis and also with the United Arab Emirates. But only it takes two to tango, they say. Only if there is the desire on the other side to enhance relations. Above all, I mean, let's keep in mind that we don't have territorial designs. We don't have border conflicts. We don't have other issues. Just maybe the situation can be manageable because we have different views regarding regional matters. I hope we can bridge the differences. And we just give a chance to diplomacy, give a chance to our diplomats, and let them work towards more meaningful relationship.
Right. On the same question, I'm going to Dr. SHELINE.
So I think Dr. Al-OTAIBI addressed this quite thoroughly already earlier in our conversation as well, the question having to do with the reaction of smaller Gulf states. And I want to go back to something the ambassador raised about why is it that it took until President Biden to say that the war in Yemen needed to end, when Clearly, the Obama administration was willing to not condemn, hoped that by not condemning Saudi aggression, the military invasion against Yemen 6 years ago, that the Saudis would be less, maybe would temper their criticism of the Iran deal. And that's not what happened. And, this was a poor gamble, because as a result, Yemen was and is devastated. And under Trump, clearly, he didn't care about Yemen, and he was only interested in selling more and more weapons to Saudi Arabia and the UAE and anyone else who wanted to buy weapons. And so, I think I was very encouraged that Biden, very early in his tenure, made such clear statements about Yemen. Again, given that Biden, like every other world leader, is grappling with the effects of the COVID pandemic. But my hope is that, as the ambassador said, that he uses his power to do something about the situation in Yemen. As he said, he wants to lead with diplomacy and turn away from the more aggressive stances of the Trump administration. But my fear is that he is merely reverting to this sort of pre-Trump status quo, wherein the United States made a lot of noise about commitment to human rights and democracy, et cetera, and yet continued to support despots around the world, remains for years and years, has been the largest exporter of weapons around the entire world. And so as long as this remains such a core part of US policy to continue to sell weapons to anyone who wants to buy them, essentially, that how can the US talk about peace? So moving forward, my hope for President Biden and for US foreign policy is to move away from the military industrial complex, which has so dominated the American economy since World War II. And that it's really not necessary. There have been numerous studies showing, and this is for the United States, but also other countries like the UAE that are building up their own domestic capacity to produce weapons, that moving forward, the fact that all of us are sitting in our respective places, away from other people because of this global pandemic, these are the problems that the world has to face, as well as climate change, obviously a huge issue for the Gulf moving forward, not only for the fact that the world is trying to wean itself off of fossil fuels. So the Gulf is obviously facing some urgency with needing to diversify their economies off of fossil fuel. But the Gulf is going to become uninhabitable as a result of climate change. And so moving forward, I very much hope that President Biden will actually not just talk the talk, but walk the walk in shifting US policy away from militarism, shifting resources away from militarism. It is insane the amount of money, $740 billion annually the United States sends to the Pentagon, which need to go to Americans, but also could be put to much better use to help support things like rebuilding Yemen. The United States committed to sell Saudi Arabia $10.7 billion of weapons every year for the past 6 years to fight the war in Yemen. And so the United States should be on the hook to pay that amount to Yemen to facilitate the reconstruction. And Saudi Arabia also has sent humanitarian aid, needs to be very much on the hook to help support the reconstruction of Yemen, as well as the UAE, as well as Iran, as well as Qatar, as well as all the countries that have profited from as well as the Europeans who profited from selling weapons to the belligerents in the war. So this question, of why is it only now that Biden is doing something about Yemen, again, unfortunately just reiterates the general hypocrisy of the United States in making these statements about wanting to support a more just and secure and democratic world, and not in fact backing up those statements with actual policy. And just one more thing moving forward, I do think it's very much in the interest of the region to not have the United States remain the military hegemon, that clearly countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, they want to fight Iran to the last American, as the saying goes, that they're, and yet when we see things like after the attack on the Abqaiq oil facility, carried out, the Houthis claimed it, as a result of Iran support or came from Iran, and this admirably muted reaction from the Trump administration. They said very little. And after that, the Saudis reached out to Iran to sort of quietly tone tensions down and hopefully prevent additional escalation towards violence, because I don't think any of these countries actually want a hot war to happen in their countries. They've seen the results in Yemen, they've seen the results in Iraq and Syria. And, moving forward, I very much hope that the priority will not be, as the United States hopefully reduces its military footprint in the region, and unfortunately is shifting towards China, which is a whole other problem, and will continue to not solve climate change or pandemics or any of the actual security threats. But my fear is that as the United States draws down from the Middle East, that these countries will just continue to invest even more in their already very bloated security budgets, instead of in their own populations and instead of addressing issues like pandemics and climate change.
Dr. SHELINE, thank you. I think we're reaching the end of the discussion. Yes, it's time for, sure, it's time for closing remarks anyway.
Very
Ambassador,
good.
please.
Thank you. First of all, I think with its crippled economy, Iran's threat is exaggerated. The threat of Iran, the threat perception is quite. It's not so. Let's say not reasonable. It's exaggerated. Iran, with its crippled economy, cannot pose such a huge threat to the countries, Gulf countries, and to Israel. But for political reasons and for ideological reasons, they would like to keep, of course, Iran high on their agenda. I think for the United States and for Gulf countries, the best thing is to engage with Iran. And to seek the possibilities of entering into a dialogue and see what comes out of it. This is the first thing. And then secondly, the United Arab Emirates, sometimes I see that they would like to play the global power beyond regional. They have their global activities and they are spending billions of dollars. And for their prestige, they would like to acquire F-35, fifth generation fighters, and technology and munitions and so on. But I think one should understand that just having so much weaponry and fighters and so on, it doesn't make you a global power, and I hope that common sense, which is not so common in the region, will prevail in the period ahead. And I am so happy and glad that Dr. SHELINE raised the issue of climate change. I agree with you, Doctor, that the decarbonizing of the world economy is going on. That oil is not on the rise, demand for oil is not on the rise. According to the Gas Exporting Countries Forum, which prepared the global gas outlook recently and declared that gas and renewable consumption demand will increase, but not oil demand in the period ahead until 2050. So let's face it, we have to fight climate change, and the adverse effects are visible. According to Mr. Kerry, who was the American new climate change representative, just last year, the United States suffered $200 billion from climate change related extreme weather conditions. So it is really a serious issue. We have to deal with it together, and it's not only one continent or one country. It's the whole. It's a challenge, a global challenge, and we need the global solutions. Thank you for the opportunity to speak at length on this issue today.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. As a closing remark, Dr. Al-OTAIBI, is there anything you would like to add?
I've enjoyed the conversation and hearing about my colleagues' views, and thank you for inviting me to speak today.
Thank you.
And good luck.
Thank you. Dr. SHELINE, is there anything you would like to add as a closing remarks?
No, just to thank my colleagues for this stimulating conversation and our host for having us.
Right. Thank you so much. It has been a fruitful conversation. So I hope you stay safe.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.